B-25 raiders turned Japanese battleships into floating wrecks instantly. It was the 1940s. The world engulfed in fire and steel, with the Pacific Ocean as its most unforgiving battleground. Japan's once invincible war machine ruled the seas, its mighty battleships standing as symbols of raw, unchallenged power. These floating fortresses were meant to terrify any who dared face them. Armored hulls as thick as city walls, and guns that could hurl death for miles. Yet in the skies above, the unlikeliest of challenges emerged. The American B-25 Mitchell bomber, a twin-engine workhorse designed for medium-range strikes, was never meant to duel with such monsters of the sea. But war has a way of rewriting destiny. What unfolded next was not a battle of equals. It was a storm from the heavens, a clash of steel and fire, where ingenuity and sheer audacity would humiliate the pride of Japan's navy. In one sudden, devastating strike, the B-25s tore into the armored beasts, reducing them not to symbols of strength, but to crippled wrecks drifting helplessly in the waves. And in that moment, the world witnessed what happens when courage dares to challenge the impossible. The Japanese battleships, towering symbols of naval supremacy, became prime targets once American forces realized their vulnerabilities. These were not ordinary ships. They were floating fortresses, massive steel monsters stretching across the Pacific, with armor thicker than concrete walls and cannons capable of annihilating anything in their path. The Japanese believed these warships to be untouchable, the unbreakable core of their empire's military pride. Yet as the war dragged deeper into the 1940s, American strategists began to see a crack in that armor, a weakness hidden behind the illusion of invincibility. And waiting in the skies above were the B-25 Mitchell bombers, sleek, twin-engine raiders not designed for such colossal prey, but destined to rewrite the rules of battle. It was in the quiet before the storm, as the Pacific sun rose and the horizon glowed with gold, that the bombers took flight. The air hummed with the relentless drone of engines, vibrations rattling through the cockpits as pilots gripped their controls. Below them lay a vast stretch of sea, calm yet deceptive, for within those waters lurked Japan's armored titans. To challenge them was madness, and every man aboard knew it. Yet there was no hesitation. Orders were clear, and the mission demanded courage beyond measure. The B-25s were not equipped with the heaviest bombs, nor the thickest armor. But what they carried into battle was far more dangerous: precision, daring, and the iron resolve of their crews. As the bombers drew closer, the sea seemed to shift. Dark silhouettes rose on the horizon, immense towering hulls cutting through the waves. Japanese battleships. Their grey armor gleamed under the sun, massive guns swiveling like predators sensing their prey. Each vessel was a city of steel, bristling with weapons, manned by thousands of sailors ready to unleash fury. The B-25 crews could see it all. The turrets moving, the glint of sunlight on gun barrels, the ominous shadows stretching across the ocean. To attack head-on meant plunging into the jaws of death. But there was no turning back now. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment history would remember. Engines roared as the B-25s began their descent, dropping lower and lower toward the sea. Bomb bays rattled, doors opening with metallic shrieks, and the payloads within, the weapons that would decide the fate of these battleships, hung ready to fall. The air grew thick with tension, every second stretching like eternity. Below, the Japanese sailors had spotted the incoming bombers. Alarm bells rang out across the decks, orders barked in frantic urgency. Anti-aircraft guns rotated skyward, loading shells, ready to unleash a storm of fire. The battleships had faced threats before, but this was different. The Americans were coming straight for them, daring to pierce their very heart. And then the first dive began. A B-25 plunged from the skies, the pilot gripping his controls with white-knuckled fists, engines screaming against gravity. The ship below loomed larger and larger, its deck crawling with defenders. The bomber leveled out just above the waves, skimming so low that salt spray kissed its fuselage. Bomb bay doors yawned open, and with a thunderous release, steel and fire plummeted downward. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first explosion slammed against the battleship's hull, sending shockwaves across the water. The armored beast shuddered, its mighty guns thrown momentarily off aim. The impossible had happened. The monster had been wounded. The Japanese gunners retaliated at once. The skies filled with tracer fire, red and green streaks tearing through the air, bursting shells shattering the clouds with deadly blossoms of smoke. It was a wall of death, a barrage meant to crush the raiders before they could strike again. Yet the B-25s pressed on. One by one they descended into the storm, engines roaring like furious lions. Bombs rained down in relentless rhythm, each detonation tearing steel, ripping open decks, and turning armored plating into molten shrapnel. The sea itself seemed to ignite, waves surging with fire and oil as explosions churned the waters. What had once been invulnerable was now bleeding under the hammer of aerial fury. The battleship crews fought desperately. Damage control teams scrambled below deck, sealing bulkheads, dousing flames, trying to keep their steel leviathans afloat. But the Americans were merciless. Every pass of a B-25 meant more destruction, more wounds carved into the pride of the Japanese Navy. Entire turrets were blown apart, their guns twisted and useless. Sections of deck vanished in firestorms, sailors hurled screaming into the sea. Smoke rose in towering columns, blotting out the sun, casting a black shadow over the carnage. To the men in the cockpits above, it was as if the ocean itself had turned into a battlefield of hellfire. And still, the bombers came. Formation after formation, they swept down with mechanical precision, each wave compounding the devastation of the last. The rhythm of destruction was inescapable. The whine of diving engines, the sudden silence as bombs dropped free, the deafening roar of impact, and the screams that followed. It was not a battle anymore. It was an execution, a systematic dismantling of Japan's naval pride. These titans, once meant to dominate the seas, were being reduced to little more than floating wreckage. Helpless in the face of relentless air power, by the time the final B-25s banked away, their bomb bays empty, the Pacific was unrecognizable. Oil slicks stretched for miles, flames dancing across the waves like a burning sea. The battleships, once gleaming and powerful, now lay broken and smoldering. Their guns silent, their hulls torn open, they drifted aimlessly, monuments not of power, but of defeat. The ocean swallowed their pride, leaving behind only black smoke and twisted steel. The impossible had been achieved. The giants had fallen. In that moment, the world changed. Japan's aura of invincibility cracked apart, exposed for what it was, an illusion shattered by the courage of American airmen. The B-25s had not merely struck ships, they had struck at the very heart of an empire's confidence. These bombers, never designed to take on battleships, had proven that ingenuity, daring, and relentless resolve could topple even the mightiest. It was more than victory. It was a statement etched into the waves of the Pacific that no power, no matter how great, could withstand the fury of determination and courage. The attack was as swift as it was merciless. For the men aboard the Japanese battleships, the first sign of danger was not the sight of the B-25s cutting through the clouds, but the deep, haunting drone of engines overhead. It was a sound unlike any other, steady, determined, relentless, carrying with it the promise of destruction. Lookouts on the towering masts shouted warnings, their binoculars flashing in the morning light as they spotted the dark silhouettes descending from the heavens. Orders barked across steel decks, sailors rushing to their stations, hands scrambling to load shell after shell into the hungry mouths of anti-aircraft guns. The air was thick with panic and purpose, for in the next heartbeat, the sky itself would explode in fire. The first wave of B-25s came screaming down from above, their wings slicing the wind like blades. They dropped lower and lower, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Japanese gunners swung their cannons upward, pulling triggers, unleashing torrents of fire into the blue expanse. Suddenly the horizon blazed alive. Dozens of tracer rounds streaked through the air, red and green streaks glowing like fiery comets against the pale sky. Explosive shells burst around the bombers, black clouds blossoming like lethal flowers, each one radiating jagged fragments of hot steel. The entire sky became a storm of death and thunder, a wall of fire erected to keep the invaders at bay. Yet the bombers pressed forward. With each burst that shook their wings, with every bullet that tore through their fuselage, the pilots held steady. Inside those cockpits, men sweated and prayed, gripping the controls with white-knuckled fists. The smell of oil and gunpowder filled their nostrils, the vibrations of the engines rattling their bones. Fear was there, of course, it always was, but it was shackled by duty, by the knowledge that this mission was larger than themselves. They were not flying for survival alone. They were flying for victory, for the chance to cripple the very monsters that had terrorized the seas. One bomber cut lower, weaving between bursts of flak. Its engines screamed as it plunged toward the waiting battleship, anti-aircraft tracers whizzing past in blinding streams. The pilot's eyes locked onto his target. A turret the size of a house, its barrels belching fire skyward. He steadied his hand, bomb doors yawning open, the payload ready to fall. At that instant, a shell detonated nearby, rocking the bomber with bone-jarring force. Shrapnel punched holes through its fuselage, sparks igniting wires, smoke filling the cabin. But the crew did not falter. With a final cry, the bombs dropped. They tumbled downward in silence before striking the deck below. A colossal explosion ripped through the steel plating, hurling men and machinery into the air. The turret that moments before had roared in defiance now lay in ruins, its barrels twisted like broken limbs. The bomber, its mission complete, clawed its way back into the sky. Flames trailing from its tail, but alive across the sea. Another B-25 made its run, strafing the deck with machine gun fire as its bombs descended. Sailors scattered in every direction, some diving for cover, others desperately firing rifles into the air in vain defiance. Explosions thundered again, tearing open the armored hide of the ship, splitting steel like paper. Fireballs rose skyward, mingling with the storm of anti-aircraft fire, until it was impossible to tell where defense ended and destruction began. The Japanese battleship, once proud and unshaken, now reeled under the blows, its great body shuddering as wounds opened across its spine. But the fight was far from over. Japanese gunners showed no surrender, no pause. They reloaded, recalibrated, fired again and again, desperate to swat the bombers from the sky. Every second, the heavens flashed with tracer fire, every heartbeat punctuated by the thunder of cannons. The noise was overwhelming, an orchestra of chaos, a deafening symphony of war. Pilots strained against it, weaving through streams of bullets, banking sharply to avoid the eruptions of flak. Some planes were not so lucky. One B-25 took a direct hit, its wings shattering into fire. The bomber spiraled downward, trailing smoke, its crew trapped in a coffin of steel. It plunged into the ocean with a final, terrible splash, disappearing into the waves. For a moment, the sea itself seemed to grieve, swallowing the wreckage in silence. Yet even that loss only fueled the fury of the others. They pressed on with renewed resolve, knowing their comrades had fallen so the mission could succeed. For the Japanese sailors, it was a nightmare without end. The constant roar of engines above, the endless barrage of bombs crashing into steel, it was as though the very sky had turned against them. Men clung to their stations with grim determination, even as fires raged around them, even as their ship groaned with wounds it could no longer bear. Smoke choked the air. Flames devoured everything they touched, and still they fought. But with every passing minute, their firepower weakened, their aim faltered. The bombers had forced them into a deadly dance, a game of survival they could not win. And so, the tide shifted. The rain of bombs became unrelenting, their precision cruel. Deck after deck erupted in destruction, entire sections of the battleships ripped apart. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent one by one, either destroyed or abandoned by crews who could no longer endure the inferno. The proud battleships, once mountains of steel bristling with weapons, were being stripped of their teeth, their claws broken, their roar silenced. From above, the American airmen saw it clearly. The giants were falling, their might crumbling under the onslaught. The impossible was unfolding before their very eyes. When the last B-25 of the wave pulled away, the scene below was apocalyptic. Flames towered hundreds of feet into the sky. Smoke billowed across the horizon, and the once mighty warships now listed helplessly, their decks blackened and broken. The Japanese had unleashed every ounce of firepower they could muster, but it had not been enough. Against speed, daring, and sheer determination, their defenses had crumbled. What remained was ruin, a floating graveyard of steel and fire. The B-25s had survived the storm, and in doing so, they had proven the unthinkable, that even the most powerful fortress could be brought down by the courage of men willing to fly through hell itself. In minutes that felt like eternity, the once proud battleships were gutted. The transformation was almost surreal, as if time itself had slowed to bear witness to the destruction of legends. What had stood as floating fortresses of steel, feared across the Pacific, now burned and bled in the water like wounded beasts. Their armored skins, once thought invincible, were torn open by explosions that struck with surgical cruelty. Plates of steel the thickness of a man's body peeled back like paper, jagged edges glowing red-hot, spilling flames and smoke into the sky. From above, the B-25 crews could see the damage clearly. The decks fractured, the turrets twisted, the hulls cracked and bleeding fire. It was not just the loss of a ship. It was the collapse of pride, the unraveling of Japan's naval supremacy in real time. On the decks of those battleships, chaos ruled. Sailors ran through corridors filled with choking smoke, water rushing through the wounds of their ship. Some carried hoses and buckets, desperate to fight back the inferno. Others carried the wounded, dragging comrades whose uniforms were scorched, whose bodies were bloodied by shrapnel. Officers shouted orders, their voices drowned by the roar of flames and the hiss of steam bursting from ruptured pipes. Explosions echoed below deck as ammunition stores ignited, each one rocking the ship with another fatal blow. The air reeked of burning oil, molten steel, and death itself. The very heart of these mighty vessels was collapsing, each second pushing them closer to oblivion. Above them, the American pilots circled, their bomb bays empty, but their mission engraved into the fiery scene below. They had risked everything to descend into hell, and now they watched as their work consumed the monsters of the sea. From their cockpits, the battleships no longer looked like invincible giants, but like carcasses torn open, writhing helplessly in the surf. Flames danced across the decks like demons unleashed, while thick plumes of smoke spiraled upward, marking the destruction for miles around. The Pacific waters, once calm and glittering under the sun, now churned with burning oil, slicks of fire floating like islands of hell. To the men above, it was a sight both horrifying and awe-inspiring. They had done the impossible. The battleships tried to fight back, even as death closed around them. Secondary guns fired sporadically, their aim wild, their operators coughing through the haze. The massive main batteries, once so feared, now sat twisted and silent, their barrels pointing uselessly at the sky. Some guns had been blown clear off their mounts, hurled like toys across the deck. Others remained intact but mute, for the crews who once manned them were dead, wounded, or scattered in chaos. The battleships groaned like wounded animals, their steel frames buckling under the weight of destruction. Each list to the side, each shudder of their hulls, was a reminder that they were no longer masters of the sea, but prisoners of their own doom. Below deck, terror turned to despair. Water poured in through ruptured bulkheads, flooding compartments faster than pumps could drain. Men sloshed through waist-deep seawater, clinging to the last chance of survival as the ship began to tilt. Some screamed for help, others pounded against sealed doors, trapped in compartments that were filling with smoke and water. The machinery that once powered the Leviathan now hissed and sputtered, turbines silent, generators flickering before giving out. Darkness consumed the lower levels, leaving only the sound of rushing water and distant explosions. The battleship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. On the open decks, sailors abandoned their posts as flames consumed everything. Some clutched lifeboats, lowering them into waters that boiled with burning oil. Others leapt overboard in desperation, plunging into the sea to escape the inferno behind them. The water was no salvation. Waves carried fire across the surface, searing flesh and suffocating men in black smoke. Lifeboats overturned, sailors flailed, cries echoed into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Still they leapt, preferring the uncertain embrace of the ocean to the certain death of their sinking fortress. It was a scene of human desperation, of bravery and fear colliding, of men once proud now reduced to survivors clinging to the edge of hope. The B-25 crews watched it unfold with grim silence. There was no cheer, no celebration, only the weight of what they had accomplished. They had reduced icons of power to wreckage, but they had also witnessed the suffering of thousands of men caught in the jaws of war. From the air, They saw the tiny figures scrambling across burning decks, the flashes of lifeboats against the blackened sea, the haunting sight of sailors disappearing beneath the waves. War had no mercy, and neither did victory. Their bombs had spoken, and the ocean itself was the graveyard. And yet, within the devastation, there was something larger than destruction. There was the message. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. Japan's battleships, the pride of an empire, had been shown to bleed, to burn, to fall. The world had been told that even the mightiest could be humbled, that courage and daring could bring down gods of war. It was more than just the sinking of ships. It was the breaking of an image, the tearing down of fear. The Pacific, once dominated by these leviathans, was now open to new possibilities. The balance had shifted, and history itself had changed course in the span of minutes. As the wreckage drifted, flames reflected across the ocean, turning the water into a crimson mirror. Smoke columns stretched into the heavens, black fingers clawing at the sky. The scene would linger in memory forever, etched into the hearts of those who witnessed it. The men in the B-25s knew that they had not just fought a battle. They had taken part in a turning point, a moment when the impossible was proven possible. The monsters had been slain. The sea, once their domain, now carried only their remains. In those moments, silence replaced the thunder of guns. The echo of battle faded into the endless expanse of the Pacific. What remained was the haunting image of giants brought low, of fire and steel adrift in a vast ocean. Time seemed to hold its breath, the horizon glowing with smoke, the waves carrying the wreckage into history. The B-25s turned toward home, their shadows gliding across the water, leaving behind not just broken ships, but the end of an era. The Japanese battleships had been proud, invincible, untouchable. But now they were nothing more than floating wrecks, humbled by the audacity of men who dared to defy them. The world took notice. In the wake of the destruction, news spread like wildfire across the seas, across the airwaves, across the very heart of nations locked in the struggle for survival. The Japanese battleships, once thought untouchable, had been reduced to burning skeletons adrift in the Pacific. To those who had feared them, it was a revelation. To those who had revered them, it was a humiliation. And to the men who had flown the B-25s, it was the living proof of what courage, precision, and audacity could achieve. The Mitchell bomber, once dismissed as a medium-range workhorse, now stood immortalized as a weapon of destiny. Against all logic, against the towering odds of steel and fire, it had torn apart the pride of an empire. The message reverberated across oceans and continents. Allied command knew immediately that something extraordinary had been achieved. Never before had aircraft of this class brought down such massive warships in open battle. The B-25s had not been designed for this. They were not armored like heavy bombers, nor could they carry the immense payloads of fortress aircraft. But they had something even greater: adaptability. They could fly low, strike fast, and dive with precision that larger planes could not. In the hands of daring pilots, they became scalpels slicing through armor, their bombs like hammer blows against the very spine of naval power. And in that moment, history no longer cared about what the aircraft was meant to do. It only cared about what it had done. For the Japanese, the shock was devastating. The Empire's naval strategy had been built upon the belief that battleships were the supreme masters of the sea, symbols of strength and fear. They were floating cathedrals of war, embodiments of national pride, worshipped by sailors and feared by enemies. To lose them not to other ships, not in a clash of broadsides, but to aircraft flying in formation, medium bombers no less, was a wound deeper than steel. It was a psychological collapse, a crack in the armor of confidence that no propaganda could conceal. The people had been told their navy was invincible. Now they saw burning wrecks and broken steel. The illusion had died. The B-25 raids became more than military victories. They became stories. Legends whispered in briefing rooms, headlines in newspapers, and tales passed among soldiers who longed for proof that the enemy could bleed. The imagery was seared into collective memory. Battleships, symbols of might, drifting helplessly with decks aflame. American bombers banking away into the sun, their silhouettes framed by black smoke and fire. To the world, it was the triumph of ingenuity over arrogance, of daring over sheer size, of the underdog defying the giant. In America, the effect was electric. Men and women on the home front, weary from years of sacrifice, read the reports and felt a surge of pride. Factories building B-25s knew their work was no longer just routine production. It was part of history in the making. Families with sons in the Air Force read about the Mitchell and dared to believe their boys were flying not just machines, but weapons capable of changing the course of the war. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been broken, and with it came a renewed confidence that the tide of war could and would turn for the crews themselves. The victory was personal, etched into memory with a permanence that would never fade. They remembered the moments when tracer fire tore past their wings, when explosions lit up the skies, when the ocean below erupted in flames. They remembered the faces of comrades who never returned, swallowed by the sea, but whose sacrifice had paved the way for triumph. The mission was more than destruction. It was proof that courage could bend fate. They had looked into the jaws of death and flown through them, leaving behind wreckage and legend in their wake. What made the victory even more profound was the symbolism. Battleships had long been regarded as the ultimate expression of military might. They were not just weapons. They were national monuments, floating symbols of empire and dominance. To destroy one was to humiliate an entire nation, to prove that power was never absolute, that size and armor could not withstand daring and skill. In this sense, the B-25s had done more than sink ships. They had shifted the narrative of the war. The age of the battleship was ending, and the age of air power had arrived. The Japanese sailors who survived carried the scars with them forever. They had served aboard gods of war, only to see them torn apart by machines they had underestimated. They remembered the roaring engines above, the rain of bombs, the way their steel world shook under each impact. For some, survival meant drifting in lifeboats as they watched their once proud ship burn and sink. For others, it meant living with the memory of flames consuming friends, of screams echoing across smoke-filled decks. They had seen their pride unravel, and they knew the war would never be the same. The Americans, too, carried scars, not of shame, but of memory. They remembered the loss of brothers who had fallen to anti-aircraft fire, who had plummeted into the sea, never to return. Each victory carried its weight in sacrifice, each moment of triumph balanced by the ghosts of the fallen. But in their hearts, they also carried the knowledge that those sacrifices had not been in vain. They had struck a blow that would echo through history, a blow that proved nothing was beyond the reach of human courage. From that day forward, the world no longer saw the B-25 Mitchell as merely a bomber. It became a symbol, a testament to what determination could achieve. It represented the daring of men willing to take impossible risks, the ingenuity of engineers who created a plane that could adapt beyond its original purpose, and the power of belief that turned steel and fuel into legends. Against overwhelming odds, the Mitchell had flown into the storm and emerged as the giant slayer. The Japanese battleships had been feared as gods of the sea, their shadows stretching across the oceans, their names whispered with awe. But under the fury of the B-25 raiders, they became nothing more than floating wrecks, instantly broken, forever humbled. The sea carried their remains, their twisted frames drifting like tombstones in the waves. Smoke curled above the horizon, marking the graves of pride. The message was carved not in stone, but in steel and fire. No power is eternal, no empire invincible. The world remembered. Historians would later write about strategies and tactics, about logistics and weaponry. But the memory that endured was simpler, rawer. The sight of a medium bomber defying the impossible, striking down giants, and proving that no fortress is unbreakable. The legacy was not just about machines, it was about men, about courage, about the eternal truth that in war, audacity can change the course of nations. The Pacific still whispers their story. In the endless waves, in the deep waters where wreckage sleeps, lies the memory of that day. The B-25s turned fear into fire, power into ruin, pride into wreckage. And in doing so, they wrote a chapter of history that will never be forgotten.